Hello, and thanks for joining me. I sometimes do a historical Welsh murder mystery video in January. This is not a whodunit and not quite a murder, the victim recovered. I'm on the track linking Llandygwydd and Llandygwydd in South Cardiganshire, which runs along the West Drive to Blaenpant mansion. It would have been used by the many people employed on the Blaenpant estate. In 1871, the formidable widow Maria Brigstock was the mistress of the house, from which she could see some of her land dropping down to the east. Among those trees, near a bend on the carriage drive, was a pair of cottages called Pendol. These were for estate workers, and that's where I'm heading now. Well, here it is, and actually there's more of it than I expected. The outer walls are intact, although there are a lot of trees growing through it, but it is recognisable as a pair of cottages. On Thursday, the 11th of May 1871, this was the scene of absolute mayhem. In one half of the cottage lived David and Mary Davis, a 70-year-old labourer and his wife. In the other, and they'd been there for a couple of years, was another estate worker, John Mackintosh, 32, and his wife, Mary, 26, and their 2-year-old baby, Isabella. They had just lost another baby a few months previously. John Mackintosh, as you can probably tell by his name, was a Scotsman from Perthshire, and he was employed as a woodsman and gamekeeper. Mrs. Brigstock had a fancy for Scottish servants, and had quite a few of them over the years. These two neighbours got on very well. Mrs. Davis helped Mrs. Mackintosh with nursing the babies. But in the first week of May 1871, Mackintosh began to behave somewhat out of character. He was apparently a quiet and dependable man, but on the Tuesday prior to the attempted murder, he had been visited by John Phillips, a surgeon from Newcastle Emlyn. Mr. Phillips said later in his evidence, "I formed an opinion that the prisoner is in a state of insanity." But somehow he didn't seem to think that that merited any action. On the afternoon of Thursday the 11th, Mackintosh was in a very distressed state. He pushed his shotgun into the Davises' cottage through the window and said, "I'll shoot you this minute." Mr. Davis hid behind a coffer. His wife was sick in bed, with Mackintosh's daughter by her. Mrs. Mackintosh had gone to Llandygwydd, about 15 minutes away. Mackintosh fired. The shot hit Mary Davis in the hand, and she, in her own words, went into a fit, not surprisingly. The second shot, thankfully, missed his own child Isabella, who had hidden behind the coffer, but hit Mary Davis in the head. Mackintosh came to the door demanding his wife. David Davis told him that she was at Llandygwydd. He hid for a while and then let the toddler out, possibly not the best thing to do in the circumstances. Mrs. Mackintosh had returned and was trying to calm him down, but he pushed her away, and in the end she went into the house and persuaded him to follow her. He then barricaded the door with some furniture. Davis called for help to one of the labourers, who came to his assistance, and word was got to Blaenpant quickly. Henry Tuffin, the gamekeeper, and John James, the farm bailiff, hurried down to Pendol, but heard a shot and found Mackintosh again outside, loading his gun. He was bootless and wild, and chased them, threatening to shoot. They ran off some distance, and he returned to the cottage. Hiding in some bushes, they watched Mrs. Mackintosh come out, catch him by the neck, and persuade him to go inside. The police had been called, and Sergeant Davis and PC Thomas Davis arrived at the cottage to find Mackintosh had barricaded himself with all the furniture piled against the door, and he was threatening to shoot anyone who approached. Mrs. Mackintosh and the child were in the cottage with him. The police took the threat seriously. Their plan was somewhat unusual. They decided that the best course of action in the circumstances was to make straw men or scarecrows, dress them in men's clothing, and then set them up where Mackintosh could see them to distract his attention, and then they would approach the cottage. We'll never know if this cunning plan would have worked, because Mrs. Mackintosh courageously took the caps off the shotgun, thus rendering it harmless, and called to the police to tell them it was safe to come in. PC Davis had to scale the pile of furniture to get to Mackintosh, who repeatedly attempted to fire at him with his useless weapon, and then, finding it didn't work, turned it round and hit the policeman hard with the stock. Sergeant Davis and a second police constable who'd arrived helped subdue Mackintosh, and he was taken into custody in Cardigan. Meanwhile, Mrs. Mary Davis was attended to by the surgeon from Newcastle Emlyn. When he arrived, he initially thought her dead, as he couldn't find a pulse, and there was considerable loss of blood, but she recovered completely. Mackintosh was obviously insane. He was paranoid and believed that he was going to be killed by someone. He refused any food given him in custody unless a policeman tasted it first. Those who saw him taken to the jail in Cardigan felt pity for him, as he obviously was not in his right mind. He was admitted to a lunatic asylum. Not Bedlam, but the Fisherton Lunatic Asylum in Salisbury. He remained there for 4 years, until he was assessed as being of sound mind. At that point he could be tried, and in 1875 he returned to the county assizes to be tried before a packed court. Interest in the case had not diminished over the passing years. David Davis had died. Mary Davis had completely recovered from her injuries and was now living elsewhere in the parish. The question was never of his guilt, but rather whether he was insane when he committed the attempted murder. The judge was convinced, and the jury brought in a verdict of not guilty on the grounds of insanity. His defence lawyer had certificates from doctors to say Mackintosh was now sane, and said his friends are here ready to take charge of him. Quite who the friends were, I don't know, but they went away without him. The judge, more or less inevitably, ordered John Mackintosh to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure. 3 months after his arrest, Mary Mackintosh had taken her son, John Donald Mackintosh, to be baptised at Llandygwydd Church, along with the public baptism of Isabella, who had been baptised previously at home with her sister Catherine, who had only lived 3 months after that. So it seems she was pregnant with a son when she found her husband on a murderous rampage and bravely disarmed him and bravely let the police arrest him. She had moved out of Penthol and gone to live at another cottage nearby called Quarry. I'm sure Mrs. Brigstock would have been kind to her, but I'm sure she could not have kept her there in the long run, because she was not doing any work for Mrs. Brigstock. What happened to her afterwards, and her children, I don't know. Perhaps they returned to their family in Scotland, but with 2 infants to support and an insane husband in an asylum and then imprisoned, the tragedy made her the most unfortunate victim of his actions.